Figures in profile, lines of people wearing very different costumes, exotic animals, gifts coming from the most remote corners of the world, ivory tusks, pottery, textiles, and lion skins. When archaeologists digging at Persepolis first beheld these bas-reliefs, they were puzzled. Why depict so many different peoples from such distant lands in one work? But slowly, clues fell into place that gave scholars the answers. The people with the ivory tusk and the okapi are Ethiopians. The dromedary is typical of the Arabs. That pointed headdress clearly belongs to the Shiites. The Assyrians are portrayed with a cart, and here are Indians with a donkey. 23 nations in all carved into this stairway, representing the first great empire in history, the Persian Empire, and the many peoples who converged on its capital. The vast Persian domain stretched from the African continent to the Indus River. It included the fertile lands of Egypt and the Sudan. It expanded into Europe with the reigns of the Shiites and the Thracians. It occupied Arabia and the Babylonian lands between the Tigris and the Euphrates. To the northeast, it extended as far as today's Uzbekistan, and to the southeast, it crossed into India, and at the center, Persia in all its splendor. For decades, these inscriptions represented an intriguing puzzle for archaeologists. In addition to being cuneiform, the text was written in 3 different languages. High up on the mountain of Behistun, perched atop a tall ladder, English Army officer Sir Henry Rawlinson valiantly transcribed the text. That was the easy part. It then took him 10 long years to decipher it. Thanks to the work of this great archaeologist, the puzzle was resolved in 1835, and a whole new world opened up to scholars. The history of the Persians, told this time through their own works. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote, "The Persians adopt foreign customs more readily than any other people." This sentence, written with perhaps a touch of contempt, actually reveals something positive and impressive about the Persians. We are in Pasargadae. The winged genie we see here appears to be a typical Assyrian figure. He is dressed as an Elamite and wears a showy Egyptian headdress. But the genie was not found in either of these lands, but here in Persia. Along with other clues, this suggests that the concept of a unified world, and perhaps the desire to belong to one, originated in Persia, and that the Persians found pleasure in trying out the different lifestyles of the empire's many peoples. Pasargadae, founded in 553 BC, was the empire's first capital. Though later abandoned by the kings in favor of Susa and Persepolis, it was never left to decline. Inscriptions like this one have survived since that time. I am Cyrus, an Achaemenid. Though it is also trilingual, written in Babylonian, Elamite, and Persian, the words call to light one of the greatest world leaders of all time. This is the tomb of Cyrus the Great, the man who built a boundless empire from nothing in just a few years. In Cyrus' time, the economy in Asia was expanding, and the people wanted stability. They wanted an end to the discord among the different tribes and peoples. There was a widespread desire to belong to a unified world. Today, we call this idea ecumenism. At that time, the concept was that of a universal empire. The first one to appreciate its value and to put it into practice was Cyrus himself. In Persia, if you wanted to offer a tribute to the gods, you'd be hard-pressed, for there are no temples here. All over Persia, just as here around Pasargadae, altars have been found standing alone on open hilltops. The traces left by fire during sacrifices can still be distinguished. Along with other evidence, these discoveries helped archaeologists understand the nature of the Persian religion. For the Persians, all of creation was divine, the sky and the earth and all its elements. Hence, sacrifices were not held in an enclosed temple, but out under the open sky. They offered their sacrifices to the sun, to the moon, to the earth, to fire, all as elements of a single deity, Ahura Mazda, who incarnated the supreme good, an early form of monotheism. The Persians, however, did not force the peoples of their empire to believe in Ahura Mazda. They allowed freedom of worship. You could dedicate your sacrifice on the altars to any god you wished. This is Susa, one of the most important archaeological sites in Iran. Relics have been found here dating back to 4000 BC. Years of excavation work have revealed only a fraction of the city, yet the great number of foundations and the remains of massive columns and capitals confirm that Susa was a palatial city equal in grandeur to Persepolis. Historical records tell us that under King Darius I in 512 BC, Susa grew in splendor, becoming a capital together with Persepolis. But why have two capitals? At 5,000 feet above sea level, Persepolis was covered by snow for most of the winter, and thus impractical for many of the governmental functions. With such a large empire to direct, the government certainly couldn't just shut down when the weather got bad. Instead, they transferred operations to Susa, a bona fide imperial capital in its own right. In Susa, archaeologists found glazed tiles that they quickly recognized as pieces of a larger picture. When they were arranged, like a sort of puzzle, they began to tell a story. They fit together to make elaborate tunics, golden jewelry, a javelin, a bow, and a quiver. But who were these warriors so richly adorned? Excavation work began in Susa in 1884. The first to realize that those warriors must have belonged to an elite unit were the French husband and wife team, the Dieulafoy. Examining the puzzle in the light of descriptions by Herodotus, they figured out that what was taking shape before their eyes was the image of one of the emperor's personal guard units, the legendary Immortals. There were 10,000 guards to protect the emperor. When one of them was struck down in battle, another immediately took his place, giving the impression that their ranks were immutable. Hence the name, the Immortals. The king they defended represented the unified state, the power capable of imposing order. And in some parts of the empire, he was seen as a divinity. The inscription at the base of this statue, sculpted in Egypt but found in Susa, bears witness to this. To you, Darius, are given power and stability. All the plains and mountains are collected under your sandals. To you are given Upper and Lower Egypt, who worship your wondrous visage, like that of Ra, for all time. The magnificent archaeological site of Persepolis, one of the most important in the world, lay hidden for 2,000 years. Alexander the Great's troops, in a drunken orgy to celebrate the conquest of the Persian capital, razed it to the ground. Then time and sand buried it for centuries. One of the excavated areas is the place where the court palaces stood. But around them is an entire city of servants' houses, artisans' workshops, and everything else that served life in the king's court, still waiting to be discovered and to reveal more secrets. This 9-pound golden tablet, a treasure in its own right, is a charter and gave scholars insight into the various construction phases of the palace city of Persepolis. By examining the remains of the buildings in the light of the translation of this and other inscriptions, archaeologists were able to attribute each newly excavated area to a particular emperor. What we see here is the original nucleus, founded by Darius. This area represents a transition from Darius to Xerxes, his son, who was defeated by the Greeks. And this area corresponds entirely to Xerxes. The largest part of the archaeological site, a sort of second city, was built by the succeeding emperors down to Darius III. The discovery overturns a conviction passed on to us by the Greeks, especially through Aeschylus and his Persians play, which relates, "The inhabitants of the Asian lands no longer obey the Persians. They no longer bear the exacted tribute, nor do they fall prostrate to let themselves be commanded. The king's greatness is finished." Nothing could be farther from the truth. As we have seen, after Xerxes, the king Aeschylus refers to, Persepolis expanded considerably under his successors, and its splendor grew. Indeed, this did not mark the fall of the empire, nor even its decline. Archaeologists have deciphered friezes and bas-reliefs portraying a moment of great celebration and expansion of the empire. This alone gives us a sense of just how strong and solid that empire was. Quite the opposite of the barbarian images that the ancient Greeks handed down to us. Archaeologists sifting through this ancient record have found images that portray delegations of different peoples. People with proud faces and erect bearing being led by a Persian master of ceremonies to an audience with the King of Kings. Their precious and symbolic gifts tell a much different tale from that of the other great emperors of history, who generally preferred to depict their subjects bound in chains. But the biggest revelation of all came from this bas-relief, found next to the processions of the peoples. The image is clearly symbolic, but what could it mean? Comparing the astral symbols with the Persian calendar, scholars have ascertained that what we see here is the constellation Leo displacing Taurus. We are thus at the first day of spring, a celebration known as Nurus. On this day, the people streamed in from neighboring areas and put up their tents around the center of the world, initiating the empire's greatest festival. Activities would take place both outside and inside the palace grounds. Those invited inside were in for a treat. The royal palace of Persepolis had two grand public halls for receptions. The first one is the Apodana. The second is the Hall of the 100 Columns. Between them is the Tripylon, a private room for the king and his counselors, and behind it lie the royal apartments. Only the delegations representing the imperial domains and the components of the imperial court were allowed to enter the rooms of the court. After ascending the great staircase to the level of the royal chambers, 13 feet higher than the rest of the courtyard, the delegates crowded into the Apadana through this grand portico. The doors and door jambs of the palace were carved in stone, which was very abundant around Persepolis, perched as it was on a terrace of living rock. The walls, on the other hand, were covered in terracotta. The Apadana, also known as the audience chamber, held as many as 10,000 people. To avoid confusing babble, a common language was adopted during ceremonies and official acts, Aramaic, an easy idiom of Semitic origin that used the Phoenician alphabet. By using a language that they themselves had to study and learn, the Persians once again proved to be in the vanguard in desiring a common world that all would want to belong to. Aramaic was the official language of the Persian bureaucracy, an important step for developing from an empire encompassing many peoples to a state composed of a single people. After presiding over the grand procession, the king withdrew to this council chamber, the tripylon. On the door to the tripylon, the king is sculpted as being borne aloft by his people, an image that might allude to what happened inside. Here, the king is meeting with his trusted aides to improve the organization of his empire and to make revolutionary decisions. It would be in this chamber where the council resolved to build new roads, chart new sea routes, establish a unified system of weights and measures, and adopt a common currency using bimetal coins made of gold and silver. The north and south doors to the tripylon, leading to the king's private apartments, are decorated with bas-reliefs showing the king entering and leaving, followed by his servants. The king and his court would have entered his private apartment up these steps. Inside the palace of Darius, you'd better be on your best behavior, or you might have to answer to the king's watchdog. What dinner time was like is suggested by these bas-reliefs. The dishes found here are made of precious metals, offering further testimony to the luxury that distinguished life in the king's court. The king, lord of the provinces and armies, appointed members of his family or his most trusted men to select positions and rewarded them with fabulous gifts. An example is this superb golden sword kept in the Tehran Museum. After the meal, the king and his entourage would move toward the Hall of the 100 Columns. This is where the delegations would present their gifts. The representatives of the peoples of the empire would wait in the courtyard, and from here, when it pleased the king, they would be invited into the Hall of the 100 Columns for the audience. This room was bigger than the first one, but located at a lower level. There was a grand portico before this hall as well. It was richly decorated, hinting at the sumptuousness and sacredness of the chamber within. Not everyone was allowed to approach the king. Sometimes you'd have to be content with just a glimpse of the emperor. When he sat on his throne in the Hall of the 100 Columns, awaiting gifts to be laid at his feet, he was enclosed in curtains and shrouded in shadow. The sparkling of his scepter was the signal that granted the right to speak. Only a very few, as we see in this bas-relief, were allowed to approach him and pay homage with a deferential kiss. The hall is so named because it really contained 100 columns in rows of 10, a forest of stone trunks towering almost 65 feet. So those who were not lucky enough to catch sight of the king could at least enjoy the magic of this enormous hall, which evoked the vastness of the Persian Empire. Mythological animals on the tops of the columns watched over the king, protecting his city and his people. A few miles from Persepolis, archaeologists discovered this building with a square foundation almost 40 feet high. What it was is still a mystery, sparking vigorous debate among scholars, not just because of its unknown origin, but also for its location close to the walls of Mount Nakshi-Rustam. Here there are decorations carved into the rock, strange crosses, human figures, inscriptions, and 4 openings as if rooms had been dug into the mountain with their entrances off the ground. There are several hypotheses regarding this work. Some say it is a temple of fire, others that it is a watchtower. But the most alluring idea of all is that it once was a library where sacred texts were kept. If you get close enough to the wall, you can see figures that, more than any others, helped scholars understand what is being said here. They are Persians who are mourning the death of their emperor. The crosses of Nakshi-Rustam are the royal tombs of Darius I and his immediate successors. Darius, the great conqueror, who expanded the Persian Empire from India to Egypt, was the first Persian king to have carved into the mountains images and phrases that were true political messages, his spiritual testament. It is here, on a mountain, not in a book, that the true history of Persia is written. That which was ill done, I made good. The provinces were in upheaval. One man was fighting against the other. I brought peace. My law keeps the stronger from harming the weaker. I repaired the city walls that had fallen from age, and I built another wall to serve from now into the future. May Ahura Mazda protect me and my royal house, and what has been inscribed by me. More than 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire controlled most of the known world. Rare gifts, such as silk, frankincense, and myrrh, were coveted in the kingdom. They came from mysterious faraway lands in the east, and they were worth as much as gold. To deliver these goods to cities in the West, caravans undertook long and perilous journeys over dangerous desert sands, passing through secluded desert cities like Petra and Palmyra. For centuries, archaeologists and explorers have attempted to uncover these long-lost desert highways. Follow us as we journey back in time to the ancient trade routes and discover the lost caravan cities of the Middle East. At the height of the Roman Empire, the allure of exotic goods such as silk, frankincense, and myrrh from the Far East was bound up in mystery. No one knew the secret of that featherweight fabric called silk, and which faraway kingdom produced it. It was believed that Arabia was a mirage, and that winged snakes protected its incense. Because of this veil of mystery, and the high cost of transportation, the Roman elite regarded these precious commodities as exclusive status symbols. For centuries, these luxurious goods traveled thousands of miles along rough and perilous routes that linked the Far East and the West. Through written accounts and archaeological fieldwork, scholars have pieced together enough evidence to trace these ancient routes to their source. In the 1st century AD, silk from China traveled along the famous Silk Road to the Roman frontier outpost, the city of Palmyra, located in modern-day Syria. Pepper and precious stones were sent across the Indian Ocean to the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula to what is now Yemen, and then on to Petra in modern-day Jordan. Together with the locally produced incense and myrrh and cinnamon from the Horn of Africa, the silk traveled north by caravan up the incense route to North Africa and Europe. A whole network of ancient caravan trading routes and cities such as Petra linked China through Arabia and the Middle East to the great cities of the Mediterranean. After searching for many years, archaeologists discovered that these time-worn, wind-blown ruins were the remains of the once affluent city of Marib. It was here in Marib that caravans picked up the sap of local frankincense and myrrh bushes that was the source of the incense trade. These remaining walls and other finds led to the discovery of an extraordinary work of engineering in both scale and the period when it was built, 8 centuries before Christ. Archaeologists realized that the walls were part of a huge hydraulic system, the legendary Dam of Marib, located in the ancient kingdom of the Sabaean, in what is now modern-day Yemen. Imagine a half-mile-long dam built in the middle of the desert. The basin of the dam collected the abundant waters from seasonal monsoons that flowed down from the coastal mountain range to the desert. The monumental dam lasted almost 1,300 years, until its collapse in the 5th century AD, marking the end of the wealth of the Sabaeans. The dam at Marib was an engineering marvel. A complex system of channels distributed water that irrigated over 12,000 acres until it was buried by the desert sands. Who were the Sabaean people with the capability to build such a huge project? They inhabited the southernmost tip of the Arabian Peninsula more than 2,800 years ago. Their fame is forever linked to a biblical figure, the Queen of Sheba. This legendary and beautiful Sabaean queen crossed the deserts of Arabia to meet the wise Israeli king of the Jews, Solomon, by whom she had a son. Historians endeavored to discover where the beautiful Queen of Sheba came from. Excavations have uncovered a series of 5 elegant, flat-sided, monolithic columns, which are believed to be the remains of the Temple of Bilqis, the true name of the Queen of Sheba, and the temple is where she was worshipped by the Sabaeans as a goddess. Further on our lost desert highway, we find Sana'a, Yemen's magnificent capital, where the incense and spice trades still flourish. It is here that we find the National Museum and the origin of these ancient people. This image is another biblical figure, Shem, son of Noah. Shem founded the age-old capital of Sana'a and gave rise to a Semite tribe, one of 3 ethnic groups into which humanity was divided. Numerous finds made in Yemen tell us more about the Sabaean civilization. These carvings are of particular interest. Known as Betel, or House of God, they are masks venerated as fetishes and were seen as the embodiments of the gods. But gods had many forms. One of the gods' caravan chiefs prayed to before setting off into the lonely night of the desert was the moon. In a hot country like Arabia, the moon was venerated much more than the sun. The resins of the frankincense and myrrh trees that grew only in southern Arabia fueled the luxurious cities along the incense trade routes. This is why the Romans called the kingdom of Sheba Arabia Felix, happy, flourishing Arabia. The discovery of this inscription, an ex voto, revealed a great deal of information about the daily life of those involved in the caravans. 2 caravan chiefs who survived the perilous journey through the desert wrote this inscription, found on the walls of Barakish in northern Yemen. The text bears witness to the wars, thieves, and natural disasters that the caravans had to endure. But perhaps the greatest danger they faced was running out of water. The incense route ran north along the Arabian Peninsula. Ancient wells and villages, such as Barakish, provided caravans a place to stop and replenish. In Barakish, water was collected in a well, and an ingenious hydraulic system pumped the cool water to the surface. A camel can travel for 2 to 4 days without water. The caravans traveling the incense route would make about 65 stops for water, depending on the season. Successful water stops were thus an indispensable part of their journeys. For centuries, legends and age-old texts elaborated on one of these desert ports, a fabulous ancient city hidden deep within the Jordanian desert. It wasn't until the late 19th century that a Swiss explorer named John Ludwig Burckhardt began his own search for this fabled lost city that seemed to have disappeared into thin air. From Bedouin stories and tales, Burckhardt believed that the lost city of Sela, or in Greek Petra, must lie not far from the Red Sea. Petra was also mentioned in the Bible as the place where Aaron, the brother of Moses, was buried. Burckhardt believed that if he found Aaron's tomb, he might also discover the lost city of Petra. Burckhardt knew that the Arabs who venerated Aaron would never allow a Christian near his tomb. So, disguised as an Arab in Muslim robes, Burckhardt hired an Arab guide to take him to Aaron's tomb so that he might make a sacrifice. The guide led the Swiss explorer through a long cleft or seek. After walking for more than half an hour, Burckhardt arrived at a stunning sight. In front of him was a huge building known from local legend as the Treasury of the Pharaoh, carved in the sheer face of the red rock cliffs. A carved urn set high on the facade was believed by legend to contain a mysterious treasure. Many bullets have been fired at the urn to unearth the treasure, but to no avail. The Treasury of the Pharaoh was only the beginning of one of the most amazing archaeological discoveries ever made, the ancient city of Petra. Burckhardt never managed to reach the tomb of Aaron to make his sacrifice. His guide, suspicious of the explorer's true intentions, cut short their tour of Petra, but Burckhardt's accounts about his journey revealed an ancient city built into the natural amphitheater of rock that had been lost for 1,000 years. The incense caravans would arrive at Petra after a 6-month journey through the desert. The inhabitants of Petra, known as the Nabateans, would offer them water, food, protection, and their hospitality for a 25% tax on every business transaction. The Nabateans, who lived in tents along the floor of the canyon, would offer their humble homes so the caravan members could rest. The purpose of the carved buildings and monumental facades at Petra is still veiled in mystery, as puzzling today as it was in Burckhardt's time. One of the more impressive monuments in Petra is known as Deir. It is more than 120 feet high and 150 feet wide. Dating back to the 1st century BC, these rock temples were originally covered with white plaster, a marble-like effect which likely dazzled visitors. Today, in this city of ghosts, the Tomb of Silk is one of the most famous monuments. Natural erosion, wind, and rain have stripped bare any of the original plaster, but the infinite veins of natural color in the rock and minerals from which it was carved provide an unforgettable spectacle. The ancient historian Diodorus Siculus said that the population of Petra was composed of settled ex-nomads who were forbidden to grow wheat, plant fruit trees, drink wine, or build houses. Even today, no trace of the early private houses has ever been found. This would explain them living in tents along the valley floor. But the nomadic tradition of hospitality known in ancient times is still carried on by the Bedouin tribes living in camps around the extinct city today. With the arrival of the Romans, a real city was built in Petra in the 1st century AD, as can be seen from the remains of this column-lined avenue and theater. The city then declined during the height of the imperial age from the 3rd century AD onwards, when the focus of commercial routes shifted further north. Roman historians reported the location of another outpost city at an intersection where the Silk Road and the incense route met. Many archaeologists set out to locate this mysterious city, believed to be buried under the vast expanse of the Syrian desert, somewhere between the modern borders of Jordan and Iraq. It was in this vast desert that a large number of columns were found. Various fortified sites or castles built during the Crusades used materials taken from cities constructed almost 1,000 years earlier. In fact, it was a site found in the desert overlooking one of these Crusader castles that drew the interest of archaeologists. As they pieced together the ruins and erected many of the fallen columns in their original placements, it was clear what had been found was the remains of the spectacular ancient city of Palmyra. In Palmyra, the glorious city of palms, archaeologists discovered one of the longest and best preserved column-lined avenues of the ancient world. Palmyra became the focus of the trade caravans and deprived Petra of its livelihood because it was so perfectly situated at the intersection of the silk and incense routes. The two most precious commodities in a desert are shade and water. Traders coming to Palmyra could stroll along the city's shady porticos and do business. They could also replenish their water supplies from the nearby Efqua oasis. In return, they would pay a high duty tax, which contributed to the city's opulence. The original portico was even more ornate than the remains now lead us to imagine. This great arch appears quite normal, but in fact, it is a creative urban design solution to an intricate problem of symmetry. The base of the arch is triangular to accommodate two facades that are not parallel. This is because the avenues were not all built perfectly straight. As Palmyra became rich, it grew without an overall city plan. Buildings and roads were constructed and intersected each other at random. To deal with these stylistic problems, a brilliant urban designer conceived a solution and created a monumental arch with two facades that were perpendicular to the streets they faced. The design allowed anyone approaching the arch to enjoy a full frontal view of the monument, no matter the direction. The ancient caravans traveling north from Petra visited Palmyra as far back as the 1st century BC. The archaeological remains that we see there today date from about the 2nd century AD, when the city was at its height. The shady porticos, statues, and magnificent buildings such as the Tetrapylon were built during this time. The Roman theater is extremely well preserved, retaining most of the stage area. The theater employed a 2nd floor and together was over 50 feet high and 150 feet wide. The richly decorated central door, the largest of 5 doors, opened onto the stage and was known as the director's door. The facade held 4 main columns with floral friezes. The theater was positioned so that the setting sun would light the stage area, bathing the stone in an infinite range of colors. The caravan traders, having sold their spices, incense, and myrrh to merchants in Palmyra for gold and precious stones, would bid farewell to the city and head back home toward Petra and Marib. Before leaving on their dangerous journeys, with the risk of bandits and desert storms, caravan traders would beseech the goodwill of the gods for a safe journey home. The greatest of the local gods was Bel, similar to the Roman god Jupiter. This massive temple was built during the Roman period. The huge sanctuary built in his honor formed a rectangle 672 feet wide by 688 feet long. The temple was located at its center. The high outer wall of the sanctuary was smooth and adorned with inset Corinthian pillars on the inside. An arcade with a double row of columns, numbering almost 300, formed another perimeter. The god Bel, venerated in the sanctuary, was a mixture of the man-like Greek and Roman gods and the embodiment of the natural forces sacred to the Egyptian and Arab peoples of the desert. Bel was the Lord God, embodiment of the luxurious vegetation that resulted from the presence of water, which could clearly be seen in oases such as Palmyra. The wealth of the city is evident in the long, elegant columns and the colonnade that surrounds the temple on 4 sides. The capitals were actually made out of bronze, another clue to how rich the city was in ancient times. Entering a long stairway located on the wide side of the temple allowed access to the interior of the sanctuary, a clear indication of Mesopotamian influence. Worshippers would climb the stairway to reach a portal and the statue of the god. Here they would bow down in the presence of power, make a sacrifice, and a donation to the temple priests. An unusual feature of the temple was the opportunity of climbing up to the roof. The access stairways were hidden within the 4 turrets abutting the upper terrace. The size difference between the relatively small temple and the much larger surrounding courtyard was another feature of Mesopotamian design. This extraordinary temple shows the Mesopotamian influence in the geometric motifs of the roof decorations. The Western-inspired columns are imports from the Roman culture. After sacrificing a goat and making a substantial donation to the temple priests, the caravan chiefs would begin the long journey back to their homeland. Back perhaps to the ancient city of Sana'a, capital of Yemen, where the incense route began long ago. The city has undergone countless transformations over the centuries, but still seems to retain a mysterious allure. With its magnificent tower homes, its colorful past, its legendary Queen of Sheba, and its riches, Sana'a is endowed with a romantic and fabled history. Indeed, with the stories its ancient caravan chiefs could tell, it could well be a story itself in the Arabian classic.
The Aztecs' crowning achievement was a gleaming capital city that astonished European explorers called the Venice of the New World.
The city spread out, glittering against its canals and its lake, bedecked with fine trees and beautiful mansions.
Their thirst for power and blood set them on a course for destruction. When it finally came, their annihilation would be swifter and more complete than the world had ever known. In 1325 AD, central Mexico, near modern-day Mexico City. A young girl, just a teenager, is celebrating her impending wedding. She is the daughter of a tribal king, and she is about to join a new tribe that has been a guest of her kingdom. That tribe is now known as the Aztecs. As part of the ritual, 5 Aztec noblemen lead her to an ancient temple for the ceremony. But as she reaches the top, the noblemen suddenly veer her away from the altar and onto a slab of stone in front of the temple, one used for sacrifice. Each man holds a limb, while a 5th lifts an obsidian knife high in the air. With one searing move, he slashes it through her chest and extracts her still beating heart. That evening, the king is invited to a ceremony to celebrate the marriage. Instead, he finds a priest performing a dance, wearing the still glistening skin of his daughter. As part of the ritual, the Aztecs had flayed her to honor the god of fertility.
He saw this, and he was absolutely horrified at what he saw, his dear daughter. And so he and his forces immediately chased the Aztecs into the lake and onto this island where they sought refuge.
The marshy island was an unwelcoming place. Yet it was from here that the Aztecs would beat the odds against them and forge the most powerful empire of the Americas.
Hi, I'm Peter Weller. When I think of the Aztecs, I think of an elegant people with beautiful skin and flamboyant headdresses of many colors, and I think of floating cities and a terrific song by Neil Young about Moctezuma and Cortez. But I also think of knives, of obsidian glass ripping into chest cavities and hands, pulling out bleeding hearts and holding them high. Most of the Aztec sacrifices were performed in a temple atop a stone pyramid like this one. The Aztecs felt that without these offerings, the sun would literally cease to rise and the universe would die. Now, Aztec history is a fusion of fact and myth. But what we do know is that this murder, as horrific as it was, not only marked the beginning of the Aztec Empire, it also marked the location from where it would rise.
The island the Aztecs were banished to after their disastrous sacrifice of the princess was in Lake Texcoco, the largest of 5 interconnected lakes covering a valley about 40 by 70 miles. Today, this once vast and open valley is teeming with what is modern-day Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the world. But 700 years ago, the island was so swampy, no one had laid claim to it. Now, as they gazed on the lake, the Aztec leader Tenoch announced to his followers that he had seen an eagle perched on a cactus in the middle of the lake, a sign from the gods that they had found their new home. They would name their city Tenochtitlan. Life is tough for the Aztecs in the early days of Tenochtitlan, but they have a vision of a powerful city modeled on an ancient and legendary city just 25 miles away. They called this city Teotihuacan, or City of the Gods.
We know very little about Teotihuacan because all we have is the archaeological remains. We don't have any writing, we don't have any documentation that really fleshes out what went on at this big city.
It was in ruins, even in Aztec times, but they believed it to be the stomping grounds of the gods and the literal birthplace of the sun itself. The place the Aztecs most revered in Teotihuacan was a pyramid that rose above the tree line. It was called the Pyramid of the Sun. The massive Sun Pyramid contains 1 million cubic yards of earth and stone, with a base roughly the same as the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. The Aztecs believed Teotihuacan was laid out in the image of the cosmos, created by their gods. Now it was this image they would attempt to replicate in the construction of their new city, Tenochtitlan. Taking on the challenge would be an Aztec leader named Acamapichtli. In 1376, he embarked on an ambitious plan to engineer an advanced city at Tenochtitlan. But there was a problem.
The swampy islands that they took over needed a lot of work. When they started to build anything, it would begin to subside.
There was simply no foundation on which to build. The Aztec solution would revolutionize the architecture of the Americas. They began by anchoring their buildings deep in the ground using a system of pilings made from wood. Workers cut stakes into 30-foot lengths, 3 to 4 inches wide. These were driven into the soft ground to make a foundation. The pilings were often surrounded with volcanic stone to add strength. Masons and bricklayers could then build walls on top of this base with confidence.
They have found wooden pylons to hold the foundations of the pyramids. The fact that it didn't sink or the fact that it didn't just topple, I think that's a major feat of engineering.
Tenochtitlan was an island city, but the lakes surrounding it were very shallow, sometimes only 7 feet deep. The whole thing looked like a giant metroplex floating on a pond. Originally, the only way to get from this floating city to the mainland was by boat. But the Aztecs eventually devised a series of causeways, sometimes 45 feet wide, that would connect their floating city to the mainland provinces. The causeway was supported by strong wooden pilings, the same pilings that supported their temples and other buildings. Thousands of these pilings had to be driven deep into the lake bed, and this presented a logistical challenge that could only be met by a strong, skilled labor force and the best of Mesoamerica's engineers.
To build a causeway, 2 lines of stakes were laid out. Then the space between them was filled with stones and earth until it reached several feet above the water level. This allowed the road to support enormous weight.
These causeways were built very straight, they were very wide, with bridges that would open up that connected the city to the north, to the west, and to the south.
The roads enabled the Aztecs to transport larger, heavier materials for building. But this presented a new challenge.
There were no beasts of burden in Mesoamerica, so everything had to be done with humans. No carts, no wheel.
Small loads would be carried on the back with a rope hung from the forehead. Large items like stone blocks or sculptures for a temple would be dragged by huge numbers of men pulling ropes, possibly using logs as rollers. Legend has it one stone bound for a temple required a force of 50,000 men to drag it from the mountains on the mainland across the causeway and into the city. The causeways would also present the Aztecs with a new way to get fresh water to Tenochtitlan. In the past, the Aztecs had transported water in canoes from the shore. But a huge boom in the city's population meant they needed a higher-tech solution to keep up with demand.
They wanted to use water from the springs on the mainland, and so they wanted to build an aqueduct.
But the springs were under control of the dominant tribe in the region, the ruthless Tepanecs.
The Tepanecs were the controllers or the dominators of all the valley. They had a very strong empire. So they were the lords of the valley. So the Aztecs were tributary subjects to them.
As the Aztec population grew, tensions with the Tepanecs began to simmer. Now the Aztecs decided to issue an ultimatum that could change the balance of power in the region.
The people of Tenochtitlan not only demanded that the Tepanecs give them the water, but also demanded that they help construct the aqueduct.
The Tepanecs' answer was swift and brutal. The Tepanec king, Maxtla, sent assassins who murdered the reigning Aztec leader in cold blood. This was the final straw. After decades of domination, the Aztecs would finally make their move and wage war against their ruthless overlords. And they would launch a series of wildly ambitious building projects around their growing island city that would earn them a reputation as the greatest engineers of the Americas.
The founding tribe of the Aztecs called themselves the Mexica. The country of Mexico gets its name from this tribe.
It is 1428, and the Aztecs have declared war on their overlords, a tribe called the Tepanecs. But to defeat the Tepanecs, they would need a little help from their neighbors. The Aztecs approached the nearby city-state of Texcoco. There, a decisive leader was on the rise. His name was Nezahualcóyotl, and his domineering leadership would be instrumental in forging the Aztec Empire. With Nezahualcóyotl at their side, the Aztec underdogs would go for the jugular. They launched an all-out attack on the Tepanec capital. After a siege of more than 100 days, they broke through Tepanec defenses and slaughtered their oppressors. After capturing the Tepanec king, Maxtla, King Netzhualcoyotl personally cut out his heart and sprinkled his blood into the waters of Lake Texcoco. Suddenly, the tables had turned.
That is the exact moment of the beginning of the empire, and the Aztecs became the leaders of the Valley of Mexico.
After conquering the Valley of Mexico, the Aztecs could now turn their attention to bringing clean water to their growing city. Remarkably, the Aztecs would independently design and build something that only a few world empires would master: the aqueduct. The aqueduct actually had two channels, each about 5 feet high and 3 feet wide. One would be cleaned and maintained, while the other was being used so the water flow was never interrupted. The twin-tube aqueduct ran for 3 miles from the mainland to the center of the island city. In town, water streamed into public fountains and reservoirs, and was distributed to the public in large clay jars or by canoe.
In comparison to the Europeans, the Aztec were a very clean people. We know that the Aztec emperor bathed twice a day. So in terms of hygiene, the Aztec people was much more advanced than the Europeans.
While the Aztec nobles were bathing in luxury, at this time in Europe, plague caused by unsanitary conditions was killing millions. King Netzhualcoyotl's own bath was one of the most unique in the Americas. It was fed by a sophisticated aqueduct system that also brought running water to his palace grounds.
Behind me is the hill of Tetzcoatzinco. And on this hill, Netzhualcoyotl built a fantastic pleasure palace. And around this palace, a virtual botanical garden filled with all of the exotic flowers of Mesoamerica. Netzhualcoyotl brought water from the Sierra Nevada mountains all the way down to here, into this hill, to his palace, just to water his plants.
To install an aqueduct there, Netzhualcoyotl had to fill a huge gorge between Tetzcoatzinco and the next hill. As the water arrived at the first hill, it gathered in small pools built to control the speed of the flow before it reached the aqueduct. After crossing the aqueduct, the water ran in a circuit around Tetzcoatzinco Hill, spilling off over the sides in rock-cut waterfalls to water the gardens. It ended up in a nearly perfectly round rock-cut pool called the King's Bath.
And from here, he could look upon his domain at Texcoco, and he could look down at the botanical gardens that he was watering with his fantastic aqueducts. It is indeed a bath fit for a king.
By the mid-15th century, with their empire on the rise, it was time for the Aztecs to choose a sovereign leader. He was called Moctezuma, and he would be the first of 2 emperors with this now famous name. Moctezuma's first order of business was to extend the empire's borders. The Aztecs captured city-states southward to the Valley of Oaxaca, westward to the Pacific, and east toward the Gulf of Mexico. By 1449, the empire contained as many as 15 million people. In the short span of 100 years, the Aztecs accomplished the impossible. They had toppled the Mesoamerican world order. But while the Aztecs dominated militarily, their island city was vulnerable to a different kind of enemy. Like New Orleans, Tenochtitlan was constantly doing battle with water. And one of Moctezuma's first projects was to protect his city from the deluge of water surrounding it.
This is what is left of Lake Xochimilco, in the southern part of Mexico City, in Aztec times, the city of Tenochtitlan. This lake, like the other 4 lakes that surrounded the city, were spring-fed. Thus, there were no rivers or streams into which it could drain. And if it rained hard enough, the water would rise up and sweep over the land and into the city itself. And this is exactly what happened in the mid-1400s when a flood of catastrophic proportions swept into Tenochtitlan. The city and the empire it commanded were almost completely destroyed, and the Aztec civilization had to once again rely upon the genius of its engineers, and one engineer in particular.
Moctezuma enlisted the help of his old ally Quetzalcoatl to protect the city he was rebuilding from the lake. Quetzalcoatl would design a solution that would make him the greatest engineer on the continent. His plan was to create a safe zone around the city with a huge dike that would protect Tenochtitlan and its inhabitants. It was designed to be larger than any earthwork anywhere in the Americas at the time, running for 10 miles just east of the city from the southern edge of the lake across to the north. The walls were a wickerwork construction made of sticks, reeds, stone, and earth. Since the lake was shallow, the dike was only about 12 feet in height, but some 27 feet wide. Quetzalcoatl fitted the dike with sluice gates, most likely wooden doors that would be raised or lowered to control the water level behind it. The dike also served another purpose. It protected their water supply.
It was important to build some sort of protective mechanism to keep salt water out of the freshwater western part of the lake.
An army marches on its stomach. So said Napoleon. Now, an ample food supply for civilians is a no-brainer in the critical development of any civilization. But the Aztecs perfected a unique method, not only to provide a substantial food supply for its civilian populace, but to fuel the military expansion of its empire.
This revolutionary engineering was called chinampas, a system that allowed them to literally create new land to farm and to live on.
If you're going to have a city of any size, you have to provide room for them. And so what they did was build up these chinampas in the lake bed.
Basically, Chinampa is an artificial island built in the lake.
They look like narrow football fields, about 300 feet long by about 30 feet wide. A chinampa was built by weaving a web of sticks floating in the water and piling reeds on top of them. Mud was then scraped from the lake bottom and piled atop the reeds to form the chinampa. It took 4 to 6 men 8 days to build the average chinampa. They were connected to the city by massive navigational canals that would take thousands of men months to build.
A chinampa like this one could produce up to 7 crops a year, whereas a farm on the mainland could yield 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 at the most. As a crop was ready to harvest on a chinampa, seedlings from another would be sprouting out of mud that would be spread on a boat adjacent to the chinampa. Then when the seedlings were ready, they'd be transported to the chinampa, and this cycle would be repeated over and over and over again on hundreds and then thousands of chinampas. Now, it was this technology that transformed Tenochtitlan from just another tribal town in the 14th century to a dominant and thriving city-state.
With their city's infrastructure in place and vast lands under their control, the Aztecs would push the boundaries of their empire further than ever before. They'd create a far-flung network of roads, Aztec superhighways. But as the empire grew, so too did their practice of human sacrifice. Soon, rivers of blood would be flowing through the streets of Tenochtitlan.
The average life expectancy of an Aztec citizen was 37 years.
Today, Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, is gone, buried under modern-day Mexico City. But 700 years ago, it was a shining capital on the rise, built by advanced engineers and led by larger-than-life emperors. By the late 15th century, the Aztec population had exploded. Their next great emperor would launch a series of conquests that would rival anything in world history. His name was Ahuitzotl, and he would prove to be an even greater warrior than his grandfather, Moctezuma. By 1502, Ahuitzotl had conquered territory from Mexico's Pacific coast and pushed the empire as far south as Guatemala.
His reign was kind of like a golden age. He was a king that opened up transport routes to the coastal areas and to lowland areas where the Aztecs got their greatest luxuries, these shimmering tropical feathers, the gold, the precious stones that the nobles and rulers wore as symbols of their station in life.
To transport riches to the heart of the empire, the Aztecs constructed a network of superhighways throughout central Mexico. Relay runners were stationed every few miles to create a sort of ancient Federal Express. Messages or goods could be sent 200 miles from the Gulf Coast to Tenochtitlan in just 24 hours, faster than the postal service today. With the empire at its height, the Aztecs under Ahuitzotl embarked on their greatest construction project, a massive pyramid at the very center of Tenochtitlan, the symbol of their absolute power. It was called the Templo Mayor, or Great Temple. The base of the pyramid was 240 feet deep by 300 feet wide and rose to a height of 15 stories. There were at least 117 steps in 2 staircases climbing 200 feet, leading to twin temples to honor the gods of rain and war. The temple was rebuilt on the same location 7 times, beginning in 1325 with the city's founding. As the empire grew, so did the pyramid. Each stage was simply built right on top of the stage before.
The Temple Mayor was built mainly with a stone called tezontle, that is volcanic stone. It's a very lightweight stone that would prevent the sinking of the temple.
For floors and walls, the Aztecs applied a lime plaster, which was a form of concrete. Some examples found today remain as hard as modern concrete, even after 500 years. Aztec workers labored for decades to complete their monument to the gods. The temple remained buried until 1978, when power company workers digging a trench accidentally uncovered a huge carved stone and discovered the temple ruins next to it. The disc, 11 feet in diameter, weighs 8 tons and depicts the dismembered body of the goddess Coyolxauhqui.
Coyolxauhqui was the moon goddess, but her brother murdered her because she became pregnant in a very shameful way. Now, the Aztecs weren't prudes by any means. Matter of fact, nobles had many wives and concubines, but amongst the commoners, particularly women, adultery was a no-no and severely punished, often by death. So according to legend, the moon goddess's brother cut her head off, and after he decapitated her, he shoved her body down a hill. The Aztecs reenacted this killing literally and frequently in festivals throughout their calendar year. They would decapitate their victims at the top of a pyramid like this and then push the carcasses down the steps to the great stone at the bottom.
For the Romans, their most precious treasure was gold. For the Egyptians, it was the afterlife. For the Aztecs, it was human blood.
They felt a sense of reciprocity with the gods. So they needed to give a thanksgiving to the gods, giving the most precious thing they had, that was human blood.
The Aztecs called it precious water, and they believed that if the gods didn't receive it in massive quantities, the world would end in apocalypse.
It was common practice to adorn the walls of the insides of the temples with fresh human blood. And the smell must have been appalling.
To dedicate his expansion of the Great Temple, Emperor Ahuitzotl held a mass sacrifice. The heads of victims were displayed prominently on skull racks around the temple.
According to some chronicles, they say that there were sacrificed 20,000 people. From a practical point of view and from a scientific point of view, it sounds impossible. So I think that the chronicle that is written by Spanish sources is basically telling us that to their eyes, they were many.
As Ahuitzotli's reign continued, the bloodletting skyrocketed. Life in Tenochtitlan soon became an orgy of death.
Friends and enemies alike would be brought in to witness the sacrifices.
It's always ritual. Sacrifice is always a ritual event. But it was also a political statement. And it was a form of intimidation.
By the time of Ahuitzotli's death, the Aztecs had institutionalized sacrificial killing and turned killing on the battlefield into an art form. They were the America's fiercest fighters, an elite cadre of whom would have a spectacular new mountainside temple dedicated to them. But even they were not prepared for the war of the worlds that was about to descend upon them.
Aztecs used obsidian to craft their blades, a volcanic stone so sharp it's utilized in modern-day eye surgery.
1502, Ahuitzotl, Emperor of the Aztecs, is dead. Moctezuma II, a 34-year-old former priest, comes to power. A world away, in Spain, an 18-year-old notary named Hernan Cortez is preparing to cross the Atlantic to join in his country's conquest of the New World. This is the zenith of the Aztec Empire. It now covers at least 80,000 square miles, reaching out from Tenochtitlan to both coasts and as far south as Guatemala. Some 25 million people are subject to Aztec rule. 38 provinces containing innumerable city-states are paying them heavy tribute, making the emperor and nobles fabulously rich.
The city spread out, glittering against its canals and its lake, bedecked with fine trees and beautiful mansions.
And Moctezuma II presided over it all. He was known for his statesmanship and military skills. A tough leader, he slaughtered the population of towns that wouldn't bend to his rule. But privately, he was troubled.
It seems that Moctezuma was a passive individual, perhaps even a depressive individual.
Legend says that when he witnessed a comet streaking across the skies over Tenochtitlan, he spent the rest of the night in tears. As the weeks went by, he became increasingly paranoid. But at the height of his obsession with the supernatural, a very real threat approached from across the sea. Spies posted along the Gulf Coast reported strange sightings offshore that they were at a loss to describe.
They never have seen a boat, so they didn't even have a word to describe that. So the Indians refer to those boats as mountains that move in the water.
In 1519, after sailing from Cuba, Cortez landed with 11 of these floating mountains and 500 men on the Gulf of Mexico, 200 miles southeast of Tenochtitlan. The tribes were astonished by these men with metal armor and animals they had never seen. As he moved inland, tribes who resisted were brutally slaughtered, but many others were happy to provide him with provisions and men.
One of the ways in which one local lord down on the Gulf Coast curried favor was to give Cortez and his company a group of women who were to not only provide for them in housekeepers sort of manner, but were also clearly meant to be courtesans as well and provide sexual services to them.
But among the concubines, one in particular caught the eye of Cortez himself. She was the daughter of a chieftain who had been sold into slavery and was called La Malinche.
They developed an intimate relationship, and in time she bore a son to him. And he would have been one of the first people of mixed blood in the New World.
But she was much more than a mistress. She became an interpreter for Cortez and her role expanded to advisor and intermediary between him and the Aztecs.
Not only was she his translator, but she could also tell him about things that were being said that he was not intended to hear or understand.
Moctezuma's network of relay runners kept him apprised of the Spaniards' movements. It was clear they were headed for his city. As he advanced toward Tenochtitlan through the summer of 1519, Cortés amassed an army of thousands. Moctezuma's army of warriors numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They wore animal costumes on the battlefield to intimidate their opponents.
Part of it was spectacle. You had just incredible costumes that the different warriors would wear.
The most important warriors were knights, dressed as jaguars and eagles.
The Aztec knights were initiated into their orders at sacred ceremonies at special temples like this one. This is the cave temple at Malinalco, one of 6 temples on this remote mountainside, a few hours south of Mexico City. It was finished by Moctezuma II around 1502, shortly after his coronation. Now, over in Europe, Michelangelo was pounding out the David for the Republic of Florence. But while Michelangelo was carving the David, the Aztecs were here carving this temple right out of the side of this mountain. And it is the only temple in the entire Western Hemisphere built in this manner. At the bottom of the stairs of Cuauhtli are the sculptures of 2 jaguars. On each side of the door, there are the remnants of 2 warriors. Now, the door itself represents the open mouth of a giant serpent. You can literally see its tongue coming out of the room. The Aztecs believed that this was the entrance to the womb of the earth. Now, the privileged warriors would come here, go into the room with sculptures of eagles, have their noses pierced, and offer blood and sacrifice to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. But this would be by no means the last time these Aztec warriors would spill their blood.
The first meeting between Cortés and Moctezuma would be peaceful, but the conquistador knew a huge and bloody clash between the old world and the new would soon take place. And the annihilation that ensued would become one of the most frightening events in the history of the Americas.
Cocoa beans were so valuable a commodity to the Aztecs, they were even used as a currency.
It is the fall of 1519. Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés has finally reached the gleaming Aztec capital he has heard so much about, Tenochtitlan.
When the Spaniards first saw Tenochtitlan, they thought they were in some kind of an enchanted vision. They thought they'd entered some kind of a dream.
A massive force of native warriors, allied against the Aztecs, accompanies him as he advances on the main causeway into the city.
The meeting of Cortés and Montezuma on a causeway approaching Tenochtitlan had to be one of the most remarkable events in world history. It's really a meeting of 2 different worlds. And Cortés offered his hand, but the minute he started to do that, to actually touch Montezuma, the noble attendants around Montezuma pushed Cortés away and said, no, 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 that's a total indignity. Nobody touches Montezuma, the great lord of the land.
The meeting of the 2 worlds was peaceful, but fraught with tension. Moctezuma by this time had become increasingly impulsive and prone to bouts of hysteria.
So the encounter was an encounter of sensing the forces, no, in each side. But the Aztecs had a diplomacy and a warfare system that was somewhat naive in comparison to the very tricky and sly system of the Europeans.
Moctezuma invited the Spaniards to stay in one of his palaces. It would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. As the Spaniards entered the city, they were so awed they thought they were dreaming. At the heart of the city stood the emperor's colossal palace. The palace of Moctezuma II was a massive complex spread across 6 acres near the Great Temple.
One of the Spaniards noted that every day at Moctezuma's palace, 600 nobles gathered, and they would hear the word of their emperor.
Moctezuma received the Spaniards in a large reception chamber just beyond the main entrance, designed to make the emperor appear omnipotent. But Moctezuma's palace would be the last ever built by the Aztecs. Not a week into their visit, the Spaniards went for the jugular, kidnapping Moctezuma. It was an audacious move, but it paid off. The empire appeared to be theirs.
Even though Moctezuma was still the official leader of the city, he was really, for some time, nothing more than a mouthpiece for Cortez.
For 6 months, tensions within the walls of Tenochtitlan slowly simmered. Then, in the spring of 1520, it all came to a head. One morning, Spanish soldiers interrupted a sacred sacrifice and slaughtered those taking part. The move sparked an uprising. For the Aztecs, the Spaniards had committed an unspeakable sacrilege. The city became engulfed in chaos as the Aztecs marched on Moctezuma's palace.
Moctezuma gets up on the top of the palace and tries to talk to the people and calm them down, and by now they're just not having any of it.
Moctezuma had become nothing more than the Spaniards' puppet, a betrayal so great in the eyes of his people, they pummeled him with rocks and arrows. Shortly after, Moctezuma's lifeless body was tossed from the palace walls. Whether he died at Spanish hands or from injuries inflicted by his own people may never be known.
And the Spaniards at that point decided this would be probably a good time to leave the city.
On the night of June 30th, 1520, the Spaniards attempted to escape under cover of darkness.
But they can't separate themselves from the plunder that they've gotten so far, so they're weighted down with all of the things that they want to take with them.
They were easy targets for the Aztec warriors, who caught them on the causeway. Bodies quickly piled up in the water. 400 Spaniards were killed, along with several thousand of their Indian allies.
That escape has come to be called the Noche Triste, the sad night.
Cortez and a few others managed to escape with their lives. The Spaniards would now destroy the shining city of Tenochtitlan for good. He would begin by severing the lifeblood of the city, the aqueduct. As hundreds of thousands of people within the city's walls were without water, Cortez created a blockade around Tenochtitlan to cut off all outside supplies of food.
So the idea of this blockade was to try to make surrender the city by hunger. And the Aztecs had a tremendous resistance, so they couldn't be defeated easily.
And what they decided to do is to mount an attack both by land and by sea.
For centuries, the lake around Tenochtitlan was a barrier against invaders. But Cortez would find a way around that. He had thousands of his Indian allies carry ships in pieces up thousands of feet over the mountains to be assembled and launched into the lake. May 1521. Cortez unleashes his massive army in a final decisive attack on Tenochtitlan. 600 Spaniards, including 100 cavalrymen and upwards of 50,000 of their Indian allies, clash with the Aztec defenders of the city on its grand causeways. Brutal fighting continued for months. Day by day, Cortez razed the city block by block. He and his Indian allies were merciless in their systematic slaughter of the population.
It was an extremely hard-fought battle, especially in the city precincts.
The Aztecs made a last stand at the great temple in Tlatelolco. Warriors lined the steep steps to rain down arrows and rocks on their enemy. But it was hopeless. On August 13th, the final Aztec leader, Cuauhtémoc, was captured and surrendered to Cortés. And that was just the beginning. 20 million would die of disease brought by the Spaniards.
By the end of the 16th century, we estimate that the native population had been reduced by about 90%.
Modern-day Mexico City has been built atop the rubble of the once majestic city of Tenochtitlan. The Spaniards leveled it during the construction of their own colonial capital, even using stones from the Great Temple to build their cathedral still standing next to the temple ruins.
This week, join me as I explore a lost civilization bathed in blood. By the early 16th century, the Aztec Empire was the largest ever to rule Mesoamerica. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mexico, they recorded that the Aztecs were conducting human sacrifice on an unprecedented scale. In one instance, over 80,000 victims in just 4 days.
It's a very sacred site.
Just who were the Aztecs, and why did they conduct ritual human sacrifice?
They reach in, grab my still beating heart, and pull it up and show it to the world.
Were the Spanish accounts grossly exaggerated, or were they true? To find out, I'll experiment with the weapons of a warrior nation. Use forensic science to examine scarred bones from an Aztec burial site, and put some of the legends of blood sacrifice to the test. We're digging for the truth, and we're going to extremes to do it.
That's the bone. This is Zócalo Square. Today, it's the heart of Mexico City, and I'm told, the largest square in Latin America. 500 years ago, this was the center of the Aztec Empire, a civilization synonymous with human sacrifice. Hi, I'm Josh Bernstein. I've come back to Mexico to explore whether or not the horrific stories of a culture soaked in blood could possibly be true.
The Aztecs became associated with human sacrifice thanks to these vividly illustrated Spanish chronicles. Created in the 16th century AD, during the Spanish conquest of Mexico, they record a culture that celebrated extreme ritual violence. A society where Aztec priests tore out the hearts of sacrificial victims and painted their temples with their blood. But are these accurate descriptions of real events? Or merely the propaganda of a conquering power? To find out, I'm meeting up with Dr. David Carrasco of Harvard University's Divinity School.
Thank you.
He's been studying the Aztecs nearly all his life.
So we're just a stone's throw from the main square. Yes, and we've arrived right at the very foot of the great Aztec temple. This is one of the greatest finds in all of the Americas. And yes, it really represented for the Aztecs the center of not only the Aztec Empire, but the whole cosmos. You could compare it to something like Mecca or the Vatican today. This was the holy of holies in the Aztec world.
That may be, but today the site appears sparse and incomplete.
Today, this is all that remains?
This is all that remains, because what happened was when the Spaniards came, they saw this as a house of evil idols, and they saw the building itself as an evil building, and they destroyed the temple, knocking off the top 85–90%.
So really what we're seeing here is just the tip of the iceberg.
It is the tip of the iceberg.
David tells me 95 to 98% of the Aztec Empire remains undiscovered. Although much still lies beneath Mexico City, 30 years of excavations at the Templo Mayor have given archaeologists new insights into the world of the Aztecs and how they built their holy city.
We can see a historical narrative in stone. What the Aztecs did was take volcanic rock, put it together with their mortar to build walls that really stood the test of time. They also built walls that weren't so heavy. And the reason they wanted to not build heavy walls was because they actually built this city on a lake, a very soggy lake, in fact.
Why in a lake? The answer can be found in the icons on the Mexican flag. According to Aztec legend, these icons come from ancient divine instructions. The Aztec were to migrate and resettle, building a new capital at the place where they saw an eagle perched on a cactus while eating a snake. That place turned out to be in the middle of a lake. Through crafty engineering, the Aztecs turned the swampy soil into solid, buildable land. They called their new city Tenochtitlan. It grew to become a thriving metropolis. At its height, in the middle of the 15th century AD, it was home to 250,000 people, as large as any European city of the time. When Hernán Cortés and the Spanish conquistadors first laid eyes on this floating capital, they thought they were dreaming. But as Cortés and his army entered the city, the dream became a nightmare. According to their accounts, the Aztec capital was a city where intense ritual violence was an everyday event.
One thing that's fundamental.
David explains that the topic of human sacrifice is a sensitive subject for many Mexicans today. They question the accuracy and savagery of the Spanish accounts. Still, archaeology has uncovered some undeniable and uncomfortable truths.
This is the precinct of the Eagle Warriors.
We enter a section of the Templo Mayor to see where Aztec warriors ritually prepared for battle.
In the Aztec world, there were two groups of military heroes. One were the Jaguar warriors, but the most powerful were the Eagle warriors. And the excavation of the Great Temple led to the discovery of this place, which was where Eagle warriors were initiated.
David tells me that archaeologists recently conducted a chemical analysis of the floor in the precinct of the Eagle warriors. What they found in this section of the temple was astonishing.
They found evidence of blood.
They found blood here in the ground.
That is, blood offerings were given here, probably by the warriors undergoing initiation.
Their own blood.
Their own blood.
David says that sacrifice was tightly woven into the fabric of Aztec life. People engaged in bloodletting, also known as auto-sacrifice. In this very room, warriors, using obsidian blades and cactus needles, would draw blood from their arms, fingers, and thighs as offerings to the gods. But David explains that this was only a small percentage of the blood offerings being made. Most of the bloodshed at the Templo Mayor came from the Aztecs' enemies. The reason for the slaughter, he says, was in part religious, and it was in equal parts a chilling display of power politics.
Once a year, a very powerful sacrifice was carried out right here at the Templo Mayor. And what happened is, enemy warriors were brought in from other communities, and they were sacrificed in a ceremony called the Feast of the Flaying of Men.
So the Feast of the Flaying of Men?
That's right. They were carried up the steps, and hidden up above, behind bowers, were the actual rulers of their own communities.
So they'd bring the heads of their competition, their enemies, here to witness this ceremony.
Yes, in this case, the sacrifice itself was a political statement. This is what happens if you defy us, if you don't pay us tribute, if you don't go along with our alliance. You come in and you watch this, or else we'll get you.
It sounds like there was a lot of complexity.
It would seem that warfare, bloodshed, and politics were part of everyday Aztec life.
This is what gives us the...
David tells me that one artifact in particular is a testament to how central blood offerings were to their religious beliefs. For a closer look, David and I head across town to the National Museum of Anthropology.
What we're entering into is the greatest image of the Aztec notion of the universe. It's one of the masterpieces of world sculpture.
The Aztec sunstone was discovered in 1790 in Zocalo Square near the Templo Mayor. This magnificently carved stone measures 12 feet in diameter and weighs over 24 tons. While it's often referred to as a calendar stone, David tells me this is a common misconception.
So when archaeologists discovered this, they thought that this spoke to the sophistication of Aztec astronomy.
In part, that's what they thought, and it was a mystery for many years, but as archaeologists and astronomers began to look at it, they realized that it wasn't an astronomical chart, it was really a stone of myth. This is myth carved into stone.
So can you explain to me then the story that's captured here?
Well, this is called the myths of the suns, and it tells us that the universe has passed through 4 previous ages prior to the Aztec age, and each of those ages is one of the boxes. Where we see now the Aztec age, the age of movement or earthquake, and there is the sun god with a tongue of an obsidian knife representing that sacrifices must be given to give him energy to move across the heavens.
David says the cultural significance of the obsidian tongue can't be underestimated. This blade is similar to the one the Aztec priests used to cut open the chests of sacrificial victims and carve out their hearts. The symbolism captured in the sunstone tells us the Aztecs believed their gods demanded human flesh for the sun to rise each day.
They had to continue to nourish the sun. They had to continue to pay back this debt of life that had been given to them.
David tells me that in addition to the Spanish chronicles or codices, we also have some created by the Aztecs themselves. Interestingly, they're much less gruesome than the Spanish accounts, but they too leave little doubt that sacrifice was part of the fabric of Aztec life.
Most people don't realize that 15 painted books produced prior to the coming of the Spaniards have survived the conquest. And we can look into these pictorial manuscripts and we can see images of sacrifice, gods sacrificing themselves, human beings being sacrificed, animals being sacrificed.
So we have the story represented both by the insiders, the Aztecs, and the outsiders as the Spanish wrote it down.
Exactly. What we have to do today is to put these two together to see what's the most accurate picture of ritual violence in the Aztec world.
I'm in Mexico City investigating accounts of mass sacrifice in the Aztec world. So far, I've learned how they built the most powerful empire in Mesoamerica and a thriving capital in the middle of a lake. But there was also a dark side. The Aztecs believed their gods required a steady diet of human flesh and blood. And Spanish records describe a culture that celebrated ritual violence on an almost unimaginable scale. In particular, several accounts describe how in a single 4-day period, the Aztec priests slaughtered 80,400 people. But did it really happen? To find out, I'm traveling to another Aztec temple about 8 miles northwest of the Templo Mayor.
We're at the archaeological zone of Santa Cecilia Acatitlan.
Dr. David Carrasco of Harvard University's Divinity School
very sacred site.
Has studied the religious beliefs of the Aztecs for over 30 years.
What they would call the house of the god.
The Aztecs worshipped over 100 gods, many requiring some type of blood offering. And it was at pyramid temples like this that the gods received their bloody sacrament.
David, I understand that, like, say, Egyptian pyramids were built as tombs for the pharaohs, and that Maya pyramids were built to create caves to get into the underworld. What about Aztec pyramids?
This is one of the most sacred places in the Aztec world conceptually because it's a house of the gods.
Okay.
We may call it a pyramid, but for these people, this is where the gods lived. The idea is that it holds great agricultural abundance under the control of the deities and the ancestors who live inside. They guard the seeds and the hearts that give life to the world outside of the hill.
For the gods to release this energy and allow life and prosperity on earth, blood offerings had to be made to the gods of the temple.
Do we have any eyewitness accounts of the ceremonies that took place here?
There are a few eyewitness accounts that the Spaniards have left us because the Spaniards happened to see some of their own soldiers being sacrificed at a temple like this one, the great temple in Mexico City.
Okay. Well, if we go up there, can you show me how the ritual played out?
Yeah, let's take a climb.
Okay.
As we climb the pyramid, David explains that before sacrifice, each victim or sacrificial vessel had to be properly prepared. During a 20-day celebration, his diet and his appearance were modified in preparation for the ritual ahead. At the end, he was given mind-altering substances.
So let's say I'm the vessel, right? Altered state, prepared. I come up here, what happens?
Well, you'd immediately come under the control of 6 priests. And these 6 priests would then take you and they would spread you backward over the stone.
Physically forcing me into position.
That's right.
Okay, well, let's pretend there are 6 invisible priests now. Which I can tell you right away, I can feel everything in here just got a lot tighter. It's not uncomfortable, but, you know, given what's about to happen, it's probably not the best scenario.
At that point, you make an incision and take out your heart.
Like in the movies, they reach in, grab my still beating heart and pull it up and show it to the world?
And they would then take the heart and they would offer it to the 4 quarters of the universe. and then they would take the heart and they would place it in a special vessel.
Okay, beyond the removal of my heart, what would then happen to my now heartless body?
It could be that your head would be taken off and become part of the skull rack. They could also skin you, because your skin was understood to be representative of the new corn.
Okay.
Other body parts could also be distributed or used in different ritual ways.
And this was something that culturally had been going on for hundreds of years. Right?
Some form of this had been going on for hundreds of years. The Aztecs seem to have escalated it as their empire got larger, their temple got larger, and the number of sacrifices got larger.
Because their gods got stronger, I suppose.
They took it to a new level, and that level is the one that fascinates us today.
So far, the accounts of the Spanish conquistadors appear to be holding up. But did the Aztecs really sacrifice tens of thousands of people in a single day? If so, how did they capture and then control so many people? Let's go find out.
The Spanish chronicles paint a frightening portrait of the ancient Aztecs. At face value, they offer powerful evidence that large armies and fearsome warriors thrived under Aztec control. But how much of this is self-serving Spanish propaganda? And if the Aztecs did possess large armies, did they also possess the war machinery needed to capture tens of thousands of captives at a time? I decide to take a look at the weapons and tactics of the Aztecs. I'm going 1,100 miles north of Mexico City to the small town of Sonoita to meet my old friend Bob Perkins. His nearly 30-year study of ancient weaponry has earned him the unique nickname Atlatl Bob.
Hi, Bob.
Hey, John.
How are you?
Hey, how the hell are you?
Good to see you again.
Yes.
It's been a while. Well, you brought some great stuff here, huh?
Yeah, brought some atlatls and darts.
Okay.
For us to play with out here. This was their preferred weapon for warfare. Your fingers would go in the finger loops here.
Bob tells me that one of the principal weapons of the Aztecs was the atlatl.
You'd engage.
And the evidence comes not from the Spanish sources, but from the Aztecs themselves. Their gods are often depicted holding this weapon with its long arrow-like projectiles called atlatl darts.
And they do look like super arrows.
Right, it's literally an arrow on steroids.
Yeah, and it looked more like this back in the day.
Right. Here we got a nice authentic example. This is made out of river cane, which is indigenous to North America.
In terms of throwing it, you'd bring your arm back,
right,
and launch the dart.
Launch it much like a tennis serve.
Well, then how about we put all this together and see how the atlatl actually works?
We always want to be careful. These are deadly weapons. Give you a little demonstration of how far these things can go. You can do 100 yards with this easy. And it does like between 120 and 140 feet per second, like 80 miles an hour.
Clearly, these long-distance projectiles would be a concern for those on the receiving end.
Go. Where do I want to let go?
Now it's my turn to throw the atlatl.
And once you push, the momentum holds it in place.
Right.
Atlatl away. Mine went more up than out.
My first attempts to throw this lethal dart are, well, pathetic.
And I assume that like any weapon, with time, the hunter or warrior would gain expertise in distance and control.
Right.
And you've got a nice target.
Bob tells me that while we'll probably never know the precise military strategies of the Aztecs, one thing is certain. They sought to maximize the number of survivors on the battlefield. Their goal? To capture their enemies alive for future sacrifices to their gods. Bob explains that the atlatl was likely used to disperse and scatter the enemy warriors. The Aztecs would then swoop in for hand-to-hand combat. But when fighting in close quarters, the Aztecs had a very different weapon of choice. It was called the macahuitl.
So what we have here is Macahuitl 101.
Right. This was their standard infantry weapon. What it is, basically sort of a canoe paddle-shaped piece of wood with grooves on either edge here, where they fixed these obsidian blades in there along the edge with pine pitch.
All right, so let's make a macahuitl.
First thing we do is heat up the pine pitch.
Okay, you get completely liquid. So pine pitch, beeswax, and charcoal.
Right.
heat that up until it gets to be like a liquid goo, and then that becomes Aztec epoxy.
Right, primitive epoxy. Hold it steady.
The combination of strong wood, black pitch, and razor-sharp blades makes the macahuitl an intimidating weapon of war.
That's looking pretty vicious there, Josh.
But was the macahuitl so intimidating that the Aztecs' enemies preferred to surrender than to fight?
Like, watch out!
We got the weapon of the foot soldier for the Aztec army. This is standard issue.
Yeah.
Here you go, grasshopper. Today, you are a man.
Oh, thank you. I have macahuitl.
Bob's hung up a few watermelons so we can test the weapon's sharpness.
Very good. I like the macahuitl.
Bob-like.
Yes.
Deadly weapon.
So we've proven that this is sharper than a melon. But I'm aware that we're not just going to stop at melons.
No. We got the beef.
We got beef. Try this thing on flesh and bone.
Flesh and bone.
Look at that. Yeah.
Nice big side of beef there.
Okay.
Bones.
Yes.
We'll see.
I think, Bob. Good?
You got the macahuitl. You're in charge.
Okay. Here we go. More effective. Switching sides.
No wonder some of the Aztecs' opponents chose surrender over war.
In there. Yeah, I can hear. That's the bone. Effective, you think?
Oh, highly effective.
Slightly. So the atlatl and the macahuitl, very effective weapons of war. But what about in terms of the quantities that people needed to create these giant sacrifices?
The whole thing with their warfare was to come in and they would hook and jab for real, but it was all out maneuvering one side or another, and once the other side knew that resistance was futile, they would start to give it up.
Bob tells me that minimizing casualties on the battlefield was preferred. In fact, warriors were given special incentives to bring back live bodies, saving them for the bloody altars that fed their gods.
The more captives they brought back for the sacrificial altar, the higher up in rank they went. They could actually go from a commoner to nobility based on their skill and prowess in warfare.
So do we know how often the Aztec were at war?
The Aztecs were in a constant state of warfare. This was a full-tilt boogie warrior society.
Bob says the Aztecs even waged war for the sole purpose of bringing back sacrificial victims. They called these campaigns the Flower Wars.
Because they were constantly at war, they always had access to more sacrificial victims.
Yes. This is their life. This is the way they were. This was their culture.
So it is possible then that there's some validity to this number.
I'm in Mexico investigating the Spanish accounts of Aztec human sacrifice. Lying on a temple altar, I've learned how victims were killed and their hearts offered up to the Aztec gods.
What, reach in and rip out my still beating heart?
I've also wielded the weapons of the Aztec warrior.
We got the beef.
We got beef.
And found out why surrender followed by sacrifice might have been preferable to fighting to the end. But could the Aztecs, as the Spanish accounts contend, actually gather 80,400 captives into their capital, Tenochtitlan, for a massive 4-day blood sacrifice? And how could a single city control so many prisoners, especially when it was planning to kill them? The answers again may lie in the images left by the Aztecs themselves. They frequently show a foaming white cup in the hands of an Aztec priest. It contains an intoxicating beverage used to subdue human victims before sacrifice. It's given one American scholar a lot of food for thought. His name is Dr. Robert Bai. He's an American ethnobotanist who's researched the plant life of Mexico for over 30 years. We're driving together to a hillside above the town of Toluca, about an hour-and-a-half west of Mexico City. Bob tells me that the white foam drink depicted in the Aztec codices is called pulque. And pulque is still made in Mexico today. produced only in rural areas, is created by the rapid fermentation of the sugary sap from the maguey plant.
Happy good. Hola, Don Juan. ¿Cómo está? Quiero presentar a Josh.
Mucho gusto.
The scientific name is agave, and the maguey plant is the common name. There are about 140 species in Mexico, and there are about 8 or 10 that are specifically used for the production of pulque.
So the same plant that makes tequila in certain parts of Mexico makes...
Right, this is a species specifically for making pulque.
The sweet-tasting liquid of the maguey is called aguamiel, or honey water. To gather the precious fluid, a few of the plant's broad leaves have been cut down to the base. The plant's central stalk has also been removed, and the aguamiel collects in the hollow that remains.
And then every day, about 4 liters of aguamiel exudes into the center. He comes along and takes out the liquid.
So can I see how it's done?
Yes. Don Juan, ¿puede empezar a sacar la aguamiel, por favor?
Sí, a little bit for you. I don't know if you can see this, but the bottle is filling up with liquid.
Depending on size, one plant can be harvested daily for up to 4 months.
So this is the aguamiel in here now.
Right. And now that he's suctioned that off, he's going to now put it into his...
That's pretty quick.
Next phase, turning fresh aguamiel into a frothing brew of pulque.
I'll let him lead the way.
For that, we head to Don Juan's home to see how it's done.
This is where pulque happens.
This is where it's fermented.
Okay.
So when he comes back from the field, what he has is his aguamiel, the honey water, and what he needs to do is put it into the batch that he has already fermented from previous days.
And then once he has the harvest basically emptied into this barrel, how long does it have to ferment?
The people here usually like the weaker pulque, so they'll leave it for about a day. Okay. Other pulques can ferment up to about 7 days, about a week.
Right, but right now it's called aguamiel.
It's aguamiel.
And then after a day it becomes pulque.
It becomes pulque.
Okay, let's try it.
Okay, so here we can see the pulque foam on top.
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely yeasty. I can taste the fermentation happening. I don't know what it tastes like though, in terms of like comparable drinks, you know?
Well, it might taste like a lightly malted beer.
Very light.
It could become stronger either by letting it ferment longer, up to about 7 days when it reaches its peak. It'll get up to about 4 to 5%.
So a few glasses of modern pulque might take the edge off a long day, but it wouldn't put you in the mood to be sacrificed. But according to Bob, Aztec pulque was a little more extreme.
So pulque was part of the ritual process. Its role was primarily to create altered states of mind.
That's correct. On one hand, we have the alcohol, which would inhibit the central nervous system, but also certain divine pulques were made using different kind of herbs that would help further enhance the altered state of mind.
Ah, so even what we're drinking is just one form of pulque.
Right. This is the pure form that is unaltered.
Salud. Salud.
Bob explains Aztec priests spiked pulque with herbs to heighten the hallucinogenic effect on their sacrificial victims before reaching the altar. To learn more about these herbs, we return to Mexico City to a very special herbal market. It's here where one can still find the hallucinogenic plants once used by the Aztec priests.
There's a nice selection of herbs here.
Yeah, we have herbs that come from all around the country and also other parts of Mesoamerica.
Oh, okay.
There's probably about 60 or 70 species of plants that were used in making different concoctions that were given to the participants in human sacrifices. In terms of really stunning the people, especially the sacrificial victims, so that they would be more submissive. And here we have a plant. This is very dangerous. This is called toloachi, that are used to numb the nervous system. I wouldn't touch it because it's very, very dangerous. And this is something that people become crazy. In fact, in Mexico,
just touching it,
and then
you're touching it.
I've been touching this for about 35 years, so people think I'm already crazy.
Oh, I see.
So this is a plant.
Toloache is also called datura.
Hold on, I wonder if I use these.
And requires very careful handling.
Wow, I didn't think you could go crazy from just touching a plant. I always wonder when I hear about plants like this, how they discovered that effect. Like someone must have one day accidentally eaten this, and went off on a little trip, and came back and said, guys, check this out.
Check this out, exactly.
Yeah? So if someone wanted to put another person in an altered state of mind, this plant would do that.
This would be one of the best plants to do that, correct.
Okay, I'll put it down before I go crazy.
Right.
Bob has analyzed the Aztec codices carefully. He believes their priests were familiar with the psychoactive and medicinal properties of many plants. In fact, he says their knowledge was encyclopedic.
And one of the other codices, they record over 3,500 medicinal plants. And today we still haven't discovered even what a third of those plants are.
Gotcha. That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's highly suggestive. The Aztecs possessed the means to chemically and psychologically incapacitate large numbers of prisoners prior to their slaughter. But was it on the scale the Spanish alleged? I'm in Mexico trying to separate fact from fiction in the bloody world of the ancient Aztecs. I'm investigating 15th century Spanish allegations of a mass sacrifice of human captives. An astounding 80,400 victims in just 4 days. I've tested the macahuitl, their ferocious sword. And I've sampled pulque, the potion they use to incapacitate their prisoners. Now it's time to review the forensic evidence. I'm headed to Tlatelolco, what used to be the second largest temple in the Aztec capital region. Today, it lies in ruin, flanked by apartment buildings. Like the Templo Mayor, very little can be seen. It was destroyed by the Spanish and only rediscovered during a modern construction project. I'm meeting Dr. Carmen Pijuan from the National Museum of Anthropology.
How are you?
Good, nice to see you.
Thank you.
Another great place.
She studied the burials here in great detail for over 20 years.
First excavations here at Tlatelolco were in 1953. They started excavating and they found part of the Templo Mayor. This is the Templo Mayor of Tlatelolco.
But they found bones here too.
Yeah, quite a lot of them.
Carmen tells me that thousands of bones were found here at Tlatelolco. Huge piles were found next to an important temple structure. The quantity and location indicated that the burials here were unusual. 2 skeletons, nicknamed the Tlatelolco Lovers, are still on site today.
That's an interesting exhibit. This is where these bodies were actually found.
Yes, they were found here, and it's a woman on the left, a man on the right. Mm-hmm. The woman is fairly young, 18 to 20 years old.
But were they sacrificial victims? The evidence to date remains circumstantial. However, the sacrificial offerings found at Tlatelolco are among the largest collections of human remains recovered from the Aztec Empire. To validate accounts of human sacrifice, scientists like Carmen have had to work backwards. They examined how people were handled after their hearts were removed. This is perhaps one of the most famous and gruesome images from the Spanish codices. But for archaeologists, it proved to be a vital clue. To find out why, Carmen invites me back to her lab at the National Museum of Anthropology.
All these boxes have skeletons from different parts of Mexico.
Cráneos.
And you can put it here.
So these came from where we just were?
Tlatelolco, yes. Yeah. These skulls are from the Zompantli, which is the skull rack. And in Tlatelolco, 170 skulls were found from the Zompantli.
Mm-hmm. So this is what you're talking about, this hole here?
Yes, and this hole was done by impacts.
These skulls are among the greatest discoveries made at Tlatelolco. Archaeologists now possess proof that the Aztecs built skull racks from the craniums of their victims.
They put a stick, like if it was a necklace.
Mm-hmm. The point was to put it on a rack.
On a rack.
Further study of the skeletal remains from Tlatelolco tells us how the rest of the body was ritually processed.
You can see the cut marks here.
Carmen shows me clear evidence of the flaying, skinning, and defleshing that the Spanish described. The score marks left on the bones tell the gruesome story.
For example, in this femur, we have the cut marks over here. You see them?
Oh, yeah.
And these cut marks were left when they were opening the articulation so that they could dismember the person.
So do you find score marks on a lot of these bones?
And in this burial, we find cut marks on almost all of the bones.
So do we know how they actually did the dismembering?
They usually used this kind of blades, an obsidian blade.
And you found these with the bones, or these are just modern replicas?
No, these were found with some of the Zompantli skulls.
So we know that there's a good chance that this type of blade was used to make these score marks, right?
Yeah, yes, exactly.
My other curiosity is that we have the Spanish chronicles. We have the references of the conquistadors.
Yes.
But we don't know if they're telling the truth. Here we have bones which seem to support the story of massive amounts of sacrifice.
Yes.
Right. So what do these bones tell us about the people who were sacrificed here?
They are very young people, and 75% are males and 25% are females.
Carmen tells me these sacrificial victims were mostly males of warrior age from areas beyond Tenochtitlan. I've already learned that warfare was the vehicle by which Aztecs captured their future victims. Here is physical evidence to support this.
The end was not to kill the warrior, but to captivate it to be sacrificed.
And there's more. Though most of the bones appear to belong to warriors, almost none bears battle scars. It's yet more proof that the Aztecs really did possess the ability to overwhelm their captives. Physically, psychologically, chemically. It seems these people barely resisted going to the altar.
This building is a repetition of an ancient myth.
I'm in Mexico investigating the Spanish accounts of Aztec human sacrifice. So far, I've examined the motives behind the violence. And I've looked at the bones left over from the slaughter.
The point was to put it on a rack.
On a rack.
I've handled the weapons used to capture the Aztecs' victims. And tasted the potions that subdued them.
Salud.
The evidence so far is compelling. There can be no doubt the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice on an unimaginable scale. But one big question remains. The Spanish wrote of a 4-day orgy of violence that left 80,400 human beings dead. Was it an exaggeration or the truth? Today, Mexico City covers 98% of the Aztec capital, and the victims' bodies cannot be easily located and counted. But there is another way to creatively put the story to the test.
As you can see, I've come to a meat processing plant, and if you're wondering why, 80,400 people sacrificed in just 4 days seems like a tremendous quantity. So I've come here to the largest plant in Latin America to see if that much flesh and bone can actually be processed using modern technology.
To give me a hand with this unusual experiment,
it's a great place.
I'm meeting Dr. Manuel Aguilar of California State University in Los Angeles.
According to the codices, we have 80,400 people in 4 days.
Yes, they give us about 20,000 roughly per day.
How does that compare to the meat processing plant?
The state-of-the-art facilities that we have produce about 375 cows per hour.
375 cows per hour?
Yes, so if we extrapolate and we calculate that they would work 24 hours, so that gives us
about 9,000
cows per day, yes.
So a meat processing plant, 9,000 cows per day.
Yes.
For 24 hours.
24 hours.
Right? If they worked around the clock.
That's right.
20,100 people in the Aztec sacrifice.
Still the Aztecs are winning, yes.
The Aztecs are winning in this very gruesome competition, okay. But that's not the fairest comparison, right?
Manuel explains that in order to conduct a fair comparison, we need to weigh the flesh of the cow alongside the flesh of a sacrificial victim.
We need to compare pound to pound to see a better proportion.
Okay, so how much would a person weigh during the Aztec Empire?
We can say an average of 150 pounds.
Okay, so 150 pounds times 20,100 people.
We're talking about 3 million pounds
3 million,
per day of sacrificed people.
3 million pounds of flesh and bone.
Yes.
Okay, nice.
With the average cow weighing about 1,000 pounds, the modern plant processes about 9 million pounds per day, or 3 times as much flesh and bone.
So the modern meat processing plant does more processing throughput than the Aztec temple, which is a very grisly comparison, but it's still fascinating. Okay.
But I want to know, using Aztec blades, would it have been possible to dismember and process even a third of what a modern plant does today?
Put on a coat?
Yes.
In order to simulate the bloody aftermath of a human sacrifice, Manuel has set up a demonstration.
Show me the beef! Okay.
Yes.
How much does this weigh?
About 150 pounds.
So that's about a person?
Yes, here, perfect. And let's do it.
Okay, so after sacrifice, now dismemberment.
I'm using a stone blade to cut the flesh off this carcass.
This is doing a pretty good job.
Yes.
Just like the Aztecs did. This specimen may be meatier than a human, but there's nothing like cutting some muscle and severing a few tendons to get a sense of the tremendous effort and manpower involved.
Watch your fingers.
Yeah.
Oh, he's got good articulation. I'll tell you, it's a lot easier slicing watermelons. I'm sure many vegetarians are now in shock and awe. And I apologize to all butchers of the world for making a serious mess.
Since I'm clearly not a butcher, and I don't have the surgical skills of the Aztecs, I decide to finish the job with some
modern technology.
And remember, this is just one piece of one carcass. The Aztecs would have had to process over 20,000 a day.
Okay.
You made it.
All right. A lot of work.
A lot of work and a very labor-intensive, this procedure.
Very.
Manuel tells me it's possible that the Aztecs possessed the means and manpower to assemble 80,000 victims. But killing and dismembering that many human beings, and inside the time frame described by the Spanish, doesn't seem possible. The Aztecs would have had to sacrifice one victim every 2 minutes at each of their 19 principal temples, around the clock, and for 4 straight days. Instead, Manuel thinks that some Spanish codices have to be considered more accurate than others.
3 codices coincide in the 80,400 number we have discussed. Another source says 60,000, and the Codex Telediano Remensis says 20,000.
So even within the codices, we have a discrepancy.
We have a discrepancy. So, and big discrepancy, because from 80,000 to 20,000 for the 4 days.
Manuel explains that 20,000 sacrifices over 4 days would leave about 6 minutes for each sacrifice. A tall order, but more within the realm of possibility.
You think 20,000 people per 4 days is the maximum possible number?
Yes, considering the parallel 19 temples working together.
Manuel says when it comes to the Spanish chronicles and their account of Aztec sacrifice, it's important not to take the numbers at face value. For example, one Spanish soldier insisted he counted 136,000 skulls on the main skull rack of Tenochtitlan.
Just imagine you would need like a kind of Empire State Building with craniums to have that kind of amount. I don't believe that they could have the time in the middle of the conquest and doing battles to count the skulls.
So the numbers we read about, Manuel, whether it's 20,000 or 80,000, were really for dramatic effect, not for a literal interpretation of this many people slaughtered on this many days.
That's exactly.
Most archaeologists now agree that the Spanish accounts are exaggerated, and that the exact scale of Aztec human sacrifice is likely unknowable. However, whatever the exact number may have been, the imagery and extent of the Aztecs' ritual violence and mass killings still shocks us today. The blood on their altars may no longer feed their gods, but it will certainly feed our imaginations for centuries to come.